Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to the Maryland Online Webinar Series presentation on using videos as a teaching and social tool in online courses. My name is Rob Coyle. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Course Development at the University of Maryland Global Campus, and I have the privilege of moderating today's presentation. I'd like to begin by formally welcoming you on behalf of the Maryland Online Board. Before I introduce our presenter today, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the Maryland Online YouTube channel in the next, I don't know, probably week or so. Secondly, we're asking everyone to please keep your mics on mute and use the chat to ask questions. I'll be monitoring the chat and do our best to make sure we get all of your questions answered as we go or later at the end of the presentation. Lastly, because everyone asks, we will share the slides out after the presentation. Our presenter today is Eric Belt, a senior instructional designer in the Faculty Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Eric's also an educational technology doctoral candidate at Boise State University. His research interests are communication, social connection, and engagement in online courses. Eric and I first met at the Maryland Online Leadership Institute and later as part of the Maryland Distance Learning Association conferences. In addition to being an all-around great guy, Eric is a Cancer with a tough outer shell, but really is a big softie. So sorry, Eric, you can't give me ammunition like that. With that, I will turn the time over to Eric.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate that. Yes. My zodiac sign is a Cancer, so that's great. Yeah, so today, like Rob said, I'm going to talk about video use in online courses. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I'll ask the question that everyone always asks. Can everyone see that? Yes. All right, great. All right. So using video as a teaching and social tool in online courses. To give you an overview of what I wanted to talk about today, basically, I did a literature review just to try to find out, like my guiding research question was, how is video being used in online and blended courses? So today, what I'm going to try to do is recap some of those highlights, pull out some of the, I think, maybe interesting findings through the literature. So I want to start by reviewing the Community of Inquiry framework. For those who might not be familiar with this, just give a little, oh, wow, don't know what happened there. A quick little recap of what that looks like. Try to identify the video uses in online courses that sort of came out of the literature review. And talk about some of the advantages and drawbacks to those video use in either asynchronous or synchronous settings. I'll talk about things to think about when going to video in those settings, and just sort of wrap up with a way to think about whether or not video is right for you. So the Community of Inquiry framework, I guess it came around the turn of the century, turn of the 21st century, as a way to, as a theoretical framework that was used to sort of code text-based discussions in predominantly asynchronous online courses. So it's a coding way to try to see if conversations in those settings are social. And the researchers sort of created this framework in three concentric circles of social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. So social presence, and it's an interesting way, I think, to just think about online courses in general, like having these three elements sort of makes for a community in an online setting. But social presence has had a rich history across multiple disciplines and has evolved over the years to sort of embody the projection of personality through communication media. So, I think that social presence gets used a lot in the language and in the research and the literature, but there are a lot of maybe a couple nuanced interpretations of what that means. But the idea is that we're social, right? So some people look at it as community, some look at it as connectedness, and little variations and nuances throughout. So teaching presence, right, as defined by Garrison and his colleagues, is the design and facilitation and direction of cognitive and social presences or processes. And then the cognitive presence is the extent to which learners can construct and confirm meaning through sustained reflection and discourse. So as I mentioned, this is like originally conceived as a framework for text-based communication. So how does this sort of manifest in video communication in online courses? And, this is something that, this was just a lit review, but it's basically my research interest is in the social presence circle of this framework. So just trying to position this presentation a little bit. So to give you a little recap of what I did for my lit review, I just looked at peer-reviewed articles from 2010 to 2020, narrowed them down through this process, this PRISM flowchart, and the eligibility. So the full text articles that I excluded, a little bit about that. So I forget the author who called I think Graham talks a lot about blended courses, but there was another author who talked about low impact blends. And that is just essentially either a face-to-face course where you're just adding a video element to it, or like it can be web enhanced, but you're not reducing anything. All right, so you're either not reducing the client time in the classroom or the activity. So I really wanted to get at studies that were in settings that played with time in a more blended sense than just adding to. So that's where that low impact blend comes into play. I didn't look at any places that were non-education, and I didn't look at laboratories or experiments in a lab. I mean, it's a lot of stuff with like eye movement and things like that. Wasn't really interested in that. I was just looking for the practitioner applications to what they're doing in their courses and how it's, things they found in those settings. I also didn't look at studies that took a deeper dive into a specific technology, right? So this was just, some studies will talk about something that they did, an initiative or something tool that they created, like a media annotation tool or something like that. And I wasn't necessarily interested in that. So really just, how are we using video in online or blended courses where we're reducing time or changing the instructional activity from face-to-face to something online or with media. So it ended up with about 64 studies. So I guess the themes or the results that sort of came about this review are probably not surprising, right? How we use video in online courses. But the predominant ones were video lectures and discussions. And this can happen in either asynchronous recorded lecture or synchronous in Zoom, like we're here today doing. Other popular, yes, or maybe not popular, but recurring themes were video assessments and video feedback to learners. And this last piece, this other category, it's what I labeled or coded as just creating video touch points. So you can think of this as like video orientations or a weekly announcement or virtual office hours, things that aren't necessarily baked into your design, that sort of happen sometimes a little bit more organically, or, I mean, an orientation video, you can certainly bake that in, but sometimes we create videos on the fly. So I just wanted to try to capture that I didn't want to try to capture it, that's what sort of came out in the literature. So yeah, so I want to talk about each of these in a couple of different ways. So delivering video lectures in the asynchronous format, right? So in the pros, where that students can have control and agency. Some studies have shown that it benefits at-risk students, and visualizing instructors is socially constructive. So, the at-risk piece of this is interesting, but mainly it points to the idea that because we can pause, rewind, and rewatch, that benefits learners. Right? They can take their time with it. They can go over it again. And I forget the specific study, but it sort of showed that students that were struggling tended to do that a little bit more, to go back to the video and rewatch, whereas students who were excelling didn't really watch the videos because they had already got it or mastered it and moved on. So there is sort of that advantage of having that ability to pause and rewind and play. But what most of us probably know is that creating videos takes a lot of time, and that production quality can vary. And obviously, our comfortability with recording videos in general will vary. And, so it can, and, some folks just don't like being on screen. So there's things, all those sorts of things come into the drawbacks of that. I would also add the shelf life of a video can even create more work, right, in the future. So you create this great video, semester 2019, and now it's already 2022. I got to redo that video, or even, every semester, because either it's too specific to that semester, or, it's the information has changed, right, which can happen. So there's a lot to consider with creating videos, lecture videos like that. I would also say that video length tends to be a subjective interpretation. So this is, you probably hear, colleagues or whomever talk about, videos need to be shorter, right? Less than 10 minutes, less than 5 minutes, right? Shorter, shorter, shorter. And I think that a lot of this stems, or at least the literature sort of points to one study by, I'm going to pronounce the name horribly, but Guo, G-U-O, and his colleagues, or her colleagues, in 2014, they did this study on MOOCs and online student viewing behavior. And what they found was that engagement was like a median engagement time was 6 minutes. So you'll often see, or in the literature, folks reference that or talk about that. Now, not many people are like, prescribing, you have to have a 10-minute video or 5-minute video or things like that, but they're pointing to shorter. And I think that what it gets at, and what we have to be careful with in creating shorter videos, is that we're not missing the mark of the learning objective, right? So if I have a learning objective that I'm trying to accomplish, and a video will do that in 20 minutes, use a video, right? You don't need to break that up. If it's like one objective. I think what the literature and the research is trying to get at is that chunking videos into smaller pieces of digestible content is a good practice. But I would just hate to just say, you got to make it less than 5 minutes, or you got to be 10 minutes or 15 minutes. I mean, what it's getting at, and especially in this one study where MOOCs, or students were watching a lot of MOOCs, videos on MOOCs, is almost the entertainment factor. Like, why do we engage in a MOOC as opposed to a, traditional online course for credit, right? It's probably, and even the researchers say it's a limitation, right? You can't blanketly apply these findings to everything, but you have different motivations, right, of learners. And there's some studies that go into YouTube video viewing habits and things like that. But, that these are designed to captivate our interest for entertainment purposes, right? And to keep us watching, which I tend to be a little fuzzy of whether or not that's educational, right? It's great when those two worlds collide and it's educational and entertaining, but I doubt that most of us can do that fairly well on just by recording a lecture. So I'll quit rambling on about that, but just something I wanted to point out. And there was a couple of studies that looked into asynchronous video lectures that are more like maybe Captivate presentations, where you have interactions on screen. So maybe like a drag and drop, or little knowledge checks that are embedded into a video, so you can sort of pause, play, and rewind, but you can interact with the content on screen. So too much of that can actually take away. So that's just something to think about. Now, in the synchronous side of things, like when we want to lecture on Zoom, I think that all the studies I looked at were up until 2020, and this was about halfway through 2020. So it really didn't get at anything that's come out in the past 6 months or so with the pandemic. So what the research up until that point was showing was that it's flexible and convenient. It can provide comparable face-to-face experiences and enhance interaction. I think that it'll be interesting to sort of watch what comes out in the next couple of years or so with those who have really had to have the, I don't know, the largest pilot study in the world on synchronous teaching in online settings, and what, will come out of the literature on that. But up until 2020, I'd say that some of the cons, which I thought were interesting, was that it was an unnecessary investment to build community. So one study was showing how you don't need to go online to build a community in an online space. Like, you don't need to be live with one another for that to happen. It can happen. I mean, the research has shown, right, with Garrison and his colleagues, the community of inquiry and things like that, that social can happen in text-based communication. So the drive to, it's sort of a natural transition, right? The inclination, if you've never taught online, you're naturally inclined to try to replicate what you did in face-to-face setting and an online setting. And it's almost like a default, right? We can only handle so much change, so we do what we know, right? And that's, that just happens. I think it's part of the human condition, right? So, but as this past year and into this next year, as things start to change and we become more comfortable with technology and how we're using it, and then we start to think about, whether this is going online, needs to be live or not. I think that'll be interesting. And I think that maybe in the next couple of years or so, we might see more blends of whether, something is synchronous or asynchronous. And, hybrid has always been this like mythical unicorn, right? Like, the students don't know that they're in a hybrid course, or what that they've signed up for meeting once a week or once a month or things like that. But, maybe it'll be more clearly delineated how we're breaking out courses. And maybe it's that, traditionally asynchronous online courses have always been asynchronous for the most part, text-based, asynchronous. And that's like part of the pitch, right? The sales, right? The students want to come because they want to do it on their own time, right? And if we start to incorporate synchronous sessions, is that going to take away from their agency, right? And their control, right? But I've started to see a little bit now where some faculty are incorporating synchronous sessions once a week in a traditionally, what they used to do, completely online, asynchronous text-based. They want to try to create that meeting time. And whether or not students can attend, they're recording it, they're placing it up for other students to watch. So it's interesting to see how the blends will evolve over time. And I mean, obviously, I think we've all really, the con of synchronous settings is that the technology can have issues, right? So something to think about with synchronous settings in particular was that text-based chatting can overwhelm, right? So one study was showing that we have multiple modes of communication happening simultaneously, right? We're looking at each other, or we're at least looking at ourselves and a mirror image of ourselves in this technology. And we're trying to interpret that. I mean, we're not in the habit of staring at a mirror 12 hours a day. So it's interesting what's happening. Although in Zoom, I'm not sure about the other ones, you can hide your view of yourself and try to create more of a natural setting for your view. And I think there was one more recent publication, I'm not sure where it came out, but that if you actually took a step back from your computer, it might help you to be in a more like sense that you're a little further away. Like you're not used to seeing everybody so up close, right? In a face-to-face setting. So there's interesting things that are coming out with that. But we have text-based chatting going on while we're engaged in all this sort of visual, right, and verbal and nonverbal things. And then we have this sort of synchronous chat happening, which is text-based. So it's a lot. So the researchers, some were even suggesting, kind of like how we set this up, where you have a moderator or somebody monitor the chat. I can't remember where I heard it, but I've heard of faculty actually tasking students with that role, right, to try to involve them. And you know, if that's what you're doing, you're having a lecture and you know you don't have anybody and you have 40 little chiclets on screen staring back at you, you know, that you ask one of the students to monitor the chat and get them involved. And then this other consideration is signaling participation requires more research. So I believe it was Hoffman in 2016 talked about signaling participation. So unmuting my microphone is signaling that I want to speak, right? Is that so, right? And there's really not enough. This was the only study that talked about this sort of thing, really. But these things that we are doing in synchronous settings, like using emojis, emoticons, virtual backgrounds, whiteboarding, screen sharing, all of these things, they really are, they're very under-researched, right? We don't have a lot of literature that investigates what these effects are having on anything, right? Our communication, our learning. So the field is wide open for studies that dive into more specific features of synchronous communication technology. Videos with discussions, right? So how do we use video in online blended courses with discussion boards? So asynchronously, this sort of came about in the studies I reviewed in 3 different ways. So it was either prompting a video discussion or prompting a discussion with a video. So what I mean by that is you have a video, you record it, and then you ask your students to discuss in text, right? The other approach was you find a video, like from YouTube or Vimeo or wherever, and you do something similar, right? But you didn't create the video. So you're outsourcing that. And then another approach was actually having a full-fledged video-based discussion where I post a video and I want you to respond in video. So of these, some of the pros that came out of that were it can lead to increased interaction and viewership and attention. And it can help less self-directed students engage. Right? So if I don't know the, let's say, norms of text-based communication on a discussion board in an online setting, right, which is very possible, even though some of us have been doing it for so long, it's like, well, that's just a forum, right? We know how to respond. If I'm not directed enough to sort of know how to communicate in that space, watching a video can help me sort of understand the tone, the nonverbal things that might be happening, and sort of see, how I should identify my role and my norm in that communication environment. And this we often, I'd say, I don't know how often it's used, right? But incorporating a third-party video into a discussion board, it provides that relevance beyond capability. So I can't record everything for every aspect of my course, right? Because it'll just be a nightmare to try to keep up with that throughout the year or whenever, year to year. So using those third-party sources can really enhance, right, our ability to connect information in meaningful ways for students, right? Because we're outsourcing, but we're finding something that's relevant, and it might not hit the mark exactly, but it's getting at the gist, or at least it can spur that and start that conversation. So using these types of videos for discussions doesn't guarantee that it's going to be a better discussion. It just doesn't. It can be distractive, and obviously the technical difficulties are common, especially if you're going to ask students to record their own video in response with tools like Flipgrid, for example. I think that what's interesting in text or video-based discussions is that this idea of an informal video can create a welcoming and safe space for students. So in a natural, like if I'm home or my office, or if it's sort of off the cuff and I'm just recording something sort of impromptu and saying, discuss this, right? That students tend to, in some studies have just shown to prefer that, but to see their instructors as real people in a real environment, and, sort of helps sort of bridge or lessen that transactional distance that we have between student and learner, and communication media, right, computer, right? So it's just interesting. Like we don't need a whole production value or a team to sort of create these things. We can record a little screencast of ourselves, in one of these tools, Screencast-O-Matic or whatever's free and out there, and sort of insert that into a discussion, and it has the potential to create a more lively discussion, although it's no guarantee. So it's interesting to think about. And I'd say that the studies are pointing to that social presence and instructor teaching presence can be enhanced when you sort of take those approaches with asynchronous video, right? You're showing a bit of yourself, and students like that, because if we think about maybe online courses 15 years ago or so, right? We not a whole lot of instructor video, I would venture to guess. We're talking, it has roots in correspondence education, right? So we're a lot of text, a lot of reading and writing. So this idea of incorporating video, I think, is starting to grow. In synchronous settings, it's interesting, right? Are we having a discussion in a synchronous setting, or is this a lecture, right? So not a lot of the studies differentiate between the two, although some researchers talk about it. In fact, I think it was Finkelstein in 2006 had a book, right? So this is 15 years ago, about meeting the threshold to go live, right? He has a little section on that, right? Whether or not this interaction or transaction is necessary for us to be all logged in at the same time, right? And I think that we're learning a lot about that, both just in the classroom, but in our everyday life and work, right? Can this meeting be an email, right? Can it be a text-based communication that occurs asynchronously? Or do we have to get together at the same time to really accomplish our goal, right? So, I think that we're learning a lot about that. So in a synchronous setting, if we think about how we might apply this in an online or blended course, it might be that we have some learning materials in the learning management system we're asking students to go through, right? And maybe even do an assignment or an activity or a discussion, text-based, and then we have a synchronous meeting later on in the week, right? Where we sort of dive a little deeper, right? As opposed to trying to have that without that, ahead of time. And I think that there's a lot of stuff out there on the flipped classroom, and what that different interpretations and variations of that. But the idea is that we sort of get to things in advance of going live synchronous, and however we can hold students accountable to that, I think will always be whether or not that just always existed. We put this stuff up on the online course, whether or not they're diving into it or not, it's typically on them. So we can't really keep track of that, but at least setting the stage for that to be, have like a more purposeful interaction in a synchronous setting is a good approach, I would say. And again, obviously if our videos are on, right, we see each other, we're building our instructor teaching presence and the social presence. And we can't really require students, right? A lot of that's come out of this, to turn on their video, right? But maybe we could show them the benefits of it, right? That we're socially connected human beings, right? That we have this drive and desire to connect with one another, and, seeing each other helps with that. And maybe it's, over time, the use of virtual backgrounds, or, maybe folks didn't want to, be invited into, our homes or office, or students didn't want that, right? So maybe this grows in time to see what'll be allowed or not allowed. I mean, I know we can't require students to do things, but it's interesting to consider, because if we're not turning on our videos in a synchronous setting, right, we're having a conference call, right? And we can just get on the phone and have that. So imagine how many lectures or discussions in synchronous settings happened over the past year that could have just been on a telephone, right? Why are we using this synchronous tool if we're not engaging the functionality of it? So I think we'll learn more about that as the years progress. Obviously, it can be attention and consuming and fast-paced and socially demanding. So this was one study in particular that focused on, it was students with disabilities, but they noted this as that it was fast-paced and socially demanding. And I would argue that this kind of applies to maybe all students, right? That it does take a lot to sort of take in the visual and the audio and the text, and that we don't really know what our role is and what is the norm, and we're learning all these things, right? So fast-paced and socially demanding, it can lead to an emotional disconnect, right? And this is interesting. So the considerations that sort of, I think, tie into this are the student gender and cultural background. So I think, now I'm doing a couple of different studies, and one of the studies that I interviewed some faculty on, they've brought up this point of gender differences, right? And how the differences that exist there, right? And whether or not we're turning on our camera, the angle of our camera, right? Whether we're comfortable going, being seen and things like that, sort of all play into it. And also the cultural background, right? There are some cultures that lend themselves to more community-based discussion in synchronous settings, where everyone has a voice or an opportunity to sort of go around the horn and talk, right? Whereas others might be a little bit more individualistic in nature and like the asynchronous aspect of reflecting before contributing, right? So those sorts of things I think are playing out in synchronous settings. Students obviously will have different preferences for how they want to communicate that we have to sort of be aware of and sensitive to. And this idea of student control, I think this all ties together with blended, are we requiring them to go online? Why are we, or go live? Are we requiring them to go live? How is that ethical if they've signed up for an asynchronous online course? Does online mean asynchronous, right? I think that it's always sort of come out that way, just because it's how it's evolved. But, what is online going to look like? Is online in 20 years just going to be this blend, right? I don't know, right? A lot of just random ideas. So moving along, the other two sort of maybe more emergent, or things that are starting to become a little bit more researched, are video assessments and video feedback. So video assessments, this sort of came about in 3 ways. And video self-modeling was such an interesting idea to me. I had never really heard of it before, or at least never knew how it was defined or operationalized. So they call this like a video feedback intervention, right? It was common in a couple of health-related studies, so like lab settings or patient care. But you record yourself doing something, right? And it's proactive because you're learning from that experience. And then you get feedback from your peers, your instructor, or just others on that, as well as yourself, right? So you get to see yourself doing the task and learn from that, which is interesting because, traditionally asynchronous online courses, we're not going to dive into, kinesthetics per se, but maybe there are ways that we can incorporate little things that help us get that tangible hands-on experience on our own. Obviously, it would never, I think, fully replace or replicate some immersive like AR or virtual reality kind of experience where we're doing things. But that like little thing, if I'm going to record myself, maybe even giving a speech or, doing a presentation, right, then I can get feedback, but I also get to see myself, which in a live face-to-face classroom, unless we're recording it and then sending it back to the students, typically doesn't happen. I would venture to guess. It's been a little while since I've been in the classroom, but I think when we're on the computers and at home and we're doing these sorts of things, it's a nice opportunity right, to do that. And it's interesting how that could be applied in different settings, like music, or, I'm playing the guitar, or hearing or recording myself sing. What do I look like when I sing? Things like that. Other uses of video assessments were video blogs, sort of like a video discussion, but a little different, right? A little different. So they're reflecting on their learning. It's a reactive learning from experience, as opposed to I'm engaging and trying to do something. This time I'm thinking about what I did, how it went, what was my journey? Did I take away from this? And it promotes personal ownership and responsibility. I don't know if video blogs are still popular. I don't know if blogs are still popular. I mean, I know that some folks have blogs, and it's just they're out there. It's an interesting space to try to engage students in a different way. Student created videos, obviously, right? If we're doing these video blogs or video self-modeling things, we're asking students to create a video. But what the differentiation here is what we're asking them to create the video of some sort of like learning objective or activity. So it's different than I'm going to record a video of my reflections on learning. And this time I'm going to record a video that demonstrates my understanding of, whatever. So I hope that that differentiation is obvious to the audience here. But, the idea that we're, instead of writing an essay about this to demonstrate your understanding, right, create a video, right? And it's a little different. So, we're expressing understanding through multimedia. And I would say that the technological competency that is involved with that is both a benefit and a barrier to learning. So it benefits oh, did you have something, Rob?
Well, there's a question that came in. There's a few of them that we can address at the end, but there's one I think that's really relevant right now. There's a comment from Elizabeth about doing TFERPA. Some institutions have decided not to require students to turn on their video. And I was just curious how that relates to this, right? Can we still require students to do a video necessarily when we maybe don't require them to have it on during a live lecture, or just for any privacy concerns whatsoever?
Yeah, that's a great point. I honestly don't know, right? I would say that these things tend to be above my pay grade. I'm just the lowly researcher that's trying to figure out, how we're using these things. But I would say prior to the Zoom boom, if we will, right, of everybody and cameras on and whatnot, I would say there were maybe a fair amount of folks who were asking students to record videos. I would venture to guess that. And I doubt it was such a concern at the time. But, I think that changes in how we use technology usually require sort of a surge in popularity to learn more about them, right? So there's a lot of these things that weren't necessarily popular, whether it's online courses, synchronous Zoom meetings, or recording or asking students to record videos. So I think we're learning a lot more about these things, and it'll be interesting to see how it develops. I think what I've tended to do if I am like advising a faculty member or suggesting ideas is to provide options for how students submit. So I would say, you can submit this as an essay, or if you prefer, a video. Right? What gets into the technological competency piece of this is how we are, assessing that, right? So I am not expert enough to assess the quality of video, right? In terms of, whether or not that's meeting the mark of a quality video production. But a lot of times we'll see in rubrics, right, that sort of criterion that's, production quality. It's like, well, does that matter? right? In the sense, right? Are we getting the message across enough to where it's meeting the learning objective? And that's what we should be assessing. So if we start getting into assessing the quality of video, it becomes an even more subjective assessment of, the student's work. So the benefit, I think, to asking students to do this is that it's probably going to be, maybe, depending on their career field, something that they'll have to do at some point, right? I don't, whether it's presenting in person or recording something, I feel like maybe there's all sorts of jobs out there that, you don't have to be near a computer, right? But for those that do, I'd say that that's beneficial. Obviously, the barrier is that we all have varied experiences, and we can't expect students to know how to record a video, regardless of age, right? I think that there's tendencies to think that younger students, right, know how to do this, and that's just misleading, right? We can't assume that anybody knows how to record a video or use screencast or things like that. So, providing video feedback. Pros, cons, and considerations. So there's I guess maybe burgeoning research space, right? A couple of studies here and there, and some groups of researchers that are trying to look into this a little bit more deeply. But what does it mean to provide video feedback? So I am recording a video of myself as the instructor and placing that, either emailing that to the student or putting in a learning management system. And I think some LMSs actually allow for that. I think Canvas did at some point, where you could record a video in the comments of your feedback to students. Other LMSs, I don't think, have that. So it happens in different ways. But so what some of these folks have found is that it can be welcoming and effective, right? In that we get to see our instructor, right, giving us feedback. Emotive, supportive, it can be conversational, it can effectively establishes social presence. And I mean effective because it is that one-to-one that you have between student and instructor, right? Which is not the case in a video lecture or a video discussion with others or the whole class, right? You have that one-on-one transaction, which students tend to be a little bit more sensitized to, right? The feedback that we get from our instructor, especially in a traditionally text-based asynchronous online course, right? We're kind of waiting, what do they say? What grade did I get? Any comments, right? And if you see a video, right, that can be welcoming and effective. Now, it's not as efficient or convenient as text, right? So if you have 250 students in one of your online courses, I doubt you're going to be creating 250 videos on every assignment, right, to make that happen. So we sort of have to pick and choose when we can do these sorts of things. It can be less organized and specific because we don't have, not necessarily, we might not be scripting out those things, what we're going to say to students. It might be a little more off the cuff. And so less specific in the fact that we're not, writing out, like the act of writing gives us time to reflect on what we're saying and how we're saying it, which is a little different than recording a video. And then one study showed that students, right, are on just complete opposite ends of the spectrum on this. Either they love it or they hate it, right? And that can be varied, right, with, how folks, I'd say every instance of an online course and every interaction that you have with a specific faculty member might not be the same, right, from course to course. So one study that sort of dives into this shows that students have different opinions, right? I don't think it's that shocking or revealing, but it's worth, noting. So the consideration I'd give to this is that if this is something that interests you and you'd like to try out video feedback, think about what it would be like if you were to record yourself with a student's Word document or essay that they submitted to you, and you're talking through it on a screencast, right? And you record that and send it to them. Or even crazier, if you have a synchronous meeting with them. Right now, you say, hey, I'd like to meet and talk about assignment 8.5, right, or whatever it is. And you just, give feedback in that way. Now, obviously these things take time, a lot of attention to, setting it all up and things like that. But if you have the ability and capability, or your class size is a little smaller with online courses, I think that you maybe try to engage these things and see what changes, right? And see if it sort of influences the student experience a little bit. So the last bit that I'll sort of kind of run through somewhat briefly, and then I'll try to go through a couple little things, and I guess we'll address some of the questions if there are questions in the chat. I haven't been looking because I said it was overwhelming, right? Video touch points, right? So orientation videos, video announcements, office hours, and checking in on group work. So orientation videos can either be technology focused, right? This is where my syllabus is. This is where you click on this, right? Or relationship focused. Hi, I'm Eric. I'm a Cancer. I enjoy breaks from Zoom, right? Or it can be both, right? So that happens. And I think that they, tend to, I'd say the technology ones help those new to online learning. Like, where do I go? Where do I find things? How do I orient myself to this tool, right? Whereas the relationship ones are more geared towards social presence, instructor teaching presence, right? That knowing that somebody is real and a person on the other end of this communication media, this intermediary, right? So there's benefit to those. Video announcements are interesting. I've talked to various faculty that either have like a weekly email that they send out, but there are some that are engaging in a video announcement of an email, or some combination of video and text. And the video is interesting because I would say it provides a visual cadence to online learning, which we're not normally seeing, right? In traditional text-based asynchronous online courses, we're getting those emails, right? We're reading a lot of text, we're reading a lot of content that's in text form and things like that. We're communicating on discussion boards in text form, right? Heavy in reading and writing. So a visual cadence is like almost with pacing, or this idea that the instructor is with you throughout each week, right? And we get to see that, which I think is just interesting and worth either more research or experimentation or practice with. And obviously, doing those sorts of things and appearing on screen will build instructor teaching presence. Now, I didn't talk a whole lot about appearing on screen as from a faculty perspective or instructor perspective, but there are some studies that really try to figure this out, and they're sort of leaning towards the idea that an instructor appearing on screen has benefits. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be, their face or whatever shown on screen, but like a Khan Academy video, right, where you see the instructor writing on the board, right, those sorts of things sort of help students, I guess, see the video and the transaction, the instructor teaching presence, as a real thing, right? This is a person who's doing this, right? And it's we can't assume that, like, when we're viewing something, yes, we know that somebody recorded the video and this, that, or the other, but are they teaching me, right? Am I seeing their instructor teaching presence come through in the video, right? Because if I have a voiceover PowerPoint that's just running through, right, it's okay. This is an audio clip, all right. Could this have been a podcast, right? Why am I watching these slides, right? You kind of, it has pros and cons, right? I'll just leave it at that, right? And I have, different preferences and ideas that I don't want to try to bias in what I'm saying here. So the synchronous virtual office hours and impromptu meetings, right? There's one study that sort of talked about virtual office hours in greater depth. And really what it boiled down to is that reminders and incentives improve attendance, and it's more casual and relaxed, right? And it helps form relationships. But, whether or not, I feel like you have to remind them and incentivize them to go, right? The students, or they're just not going to do it, right? So maybe they will, maybe they won't, right? I think every student is different, but I've heard a lot of faculty talk about how they've always had a virtual office hour, right? And nobody ever shows up, right? Or they put it in their syllabi and it's there and nobody attends, right? And if you're not reminding them, like, on a regular basis and incentivizing them to come, or, even, maybe we even talk about virtual office hours as synchronous discussions, right? So like get it, like, and I think sure folks are experimenting with this, over the past year, but how we're getting people to come to talk about it and talk about it with the instructor. And I think that's ultimately the goal of virtual office hour, but and you can obviously set those up on an individual basis. Checking in on group work. This is the last bit of this that I'll try to cover is checking in on group work in synchronous settings. There was one study that sort of talked about the breakout rooms and the feature of Zoom or these types of technologies where we break students out into groups. And what it was saying in this study with these students is that they didn't prefer that the instructor was sort of hopping from room to room to check in this synchronous space, right? They preferred if it was, we were having a group meeting on our own in a Zoom thing, and this instructor was a part of that. So, separate Zoom meetings for each group, as opposed to using one sync meeting with all these breakout groups. Thought it was interesting to point out. Obviously, if we're engaging in these technologies, it can reduce the feelings of isolation, that I'm alone, that I have to be so self-directed and isolated in my online learning. That's traditionally asynchronous, and it can build community. So, the key takeaways. Appearing on screen can help build instructor and teaching and social presence. Right? That's just, and how that appears can be different. So writing on the screen, an image of yourself. Be wary of the confirmation bias and familiarity principle. The idea is that just because we tried something once doesn't mean it's how it's going to be the next time, right? And, just we have to be willing to change and evolve with these technologies and how we're using them. And just because something didn't go well a while ago doesn't mean that it can't go well again in the future. And my little plug there is to place the emphasis on the educational value over the entertainment value of the video, right? Like learning objectives, right? That's what we're trying to get at. So my questions to consider, so meeting the threshold to go live or meeting the threshold to use video, if you will. Do I have a clearly defined learning objective? Should this be asynchronous or synchronous? Is video the appropriate or the ideal medium to use? And what tool is then best to support the intended interaction? So often we go right to the tool. We go right to, I hear everybody's using VoiceThread. I hear everybody's using whatever, SoftChalk, Flipgrid, whatever. And we want to dive right into it. But we need to back up and think about our course, our design, our structure, what we're asking students to do, and does this tool fit? So like, don't go to the tool right away, right? Go to your assignment and think about what you're asking them to do, and does changing that interaction make sense? So, this is a really crude example, right? But students in online courses tend to feel isolated beginning of the semester. They like the ability to log in at their convenience, but they're struggling to make personal connections, right? So my learning objective probably doesn't meet Bloom's taxonomy, right? But it's introduce yourself to your peers and your instructors, right? My activity, it's traditionally an asynchronous discussion board. Video, I've learned, right, helps build my instructor teaching presence and social presence. And maybe, the introduction discussions in years past have always been routine and mundane, right? And I want this icebreaker activity to sort of build community and let everyone know that they're in this together and they're not alone, right? So video can help support this. And an asynchronous video helps students sort of retain their control and agency of how they participate, right? They can do this on their own time, but they don't have to log in at the same time to make it happen, which sort of meets the criteria, I guess, of an asynchronous online course, right? And then lastly, what tools are out there that can help me facilitate that? Flipgrid is one, right? I can have an asynchronous video-based discussion that is probably a different icebreaker or introduction discussion that students who have been taking online courses for a while might be used to, right? And eventually they'll probably be like, oh, this is another Flipgrid, right? But that's that. So thank you, appreciate it. That is my time.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So we do have 5-6 minutes left. I'm hoping we can address some of the questions that have come in. First, from Wendy, do the studies address the subject matter or major for synchronous or asynchronous comparisons? I guess just, is there anything in the literature about differences between various subject matters?
Yes. So Quick note, I'm going to submit this study for publication in the next couple weeks or so. So hopefully it gets accepted and peer reviewed and all of those sorts of things. But what I put in there was a breakdown of where these studies came from, so the disciplines. And I would say that a majority of it is in teacher education settings.
Mhm. Okay.
So there's fewer, and then we get into, if we group STEM into a discipline, then there's probably a good amount. But if we break them out into science, technology, engineering, right, it's fewer and fewer. So the bulk of it is in teacher education courses that come out of the U.S.
Okay, thank you. I think I know the answer to this already, but did any of the literature discuss faculty hostility or outright refusal to integrate online teaching modalities into their instruction?
I think that there's a general, you might see that in like the introduction or the background of a study, where they'll talk about a hesitancy or reluctance to go online. And despite research to the contrary, right? Is there something, you might see something along those lines, or resistance.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Next question comes from Matt. During your presentation, you mentioned the attempt to replicate the face-to-face experience by engaging in synchronous meetings when this isn't always the best modality for the learning objective. What made you decide to decide to provide this presentation as a synchronous lecture? What are the benefits of this format to your objectives for us?
Yes.
Internal reflection.
It is, right. A little video self-modeling here.
Mhm.
I would say that my objectives here were self-serving. It was opportunity for professional development and growth, and a way to communicate others. I think that we have a lot of outlets for how we communicate. And given that this format is not necessarily an online course, right? I don't know if I would give this as a lecture to students.
Right.
But so I think the setting and the context plays into it. And this obviously is a study on a lit review, right? That I'm going to submit for publication. So the actual study that my findings will be out there and to disseminate that way. So this is a way to sort of talk about this with colleagues, I guess, and share what I found, give voice to the work that I did. So it is self-serving.
Great. Well, you also said you're going to submit for publication. So really you have both, right? Next question is from Elizabeth, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to jump down to, for certain lengthy videos, is the talking head really important? Might there be an advantage to presenting longer online video lectures as audio only podcasts? It's a format that students can listen to in their cars or out on their walks.
I'd say absolutely. I mean, I think that, whatever format works best and what you think works best, give it a go. I'd say that you can have talking heads in different ways, right? Where it's just talking head, or you can have it appear in like a tiny little screen where the slides are up and the talking head's in the bottom right-hand corner. There's some studies that explore those sorts of things. But, if it gets at that this is best served as a podcast, I say go for it.
I've often been talking at UMGC about, let's try to offer both options, see which one students take advantage of the most, just to see if we can learn anything from that. But that's one of those things easier said than for my media team to do. From Matt, per the point about students not liking the instructor hopping around between different breakout rooms, is there anything, what about, this did the students not like specifically? Did they not like being left alone without the instructor? Did they not like the instructor butting in while they were in the middle of a successful collaboration? Was there anything that spoke about that?
Yeah, I would have to dive back into that study a little bit more to give you an accurate response. But what I would say that I recall or glean from it was that they felt like it was split attention, that the instructor was just coming in and like, just Zoom bombing. How's the group work going? All right, see you later, as opposed to being a more dedicated participant.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, well, we are at time. So let me thank you, Eric, for your excellent presentation today. And on behalf of Maryland Online, I'd like to thank all the participants for attending today and for the questions. As a reminder, this presentation was recorded and will be made available on the Maryland Online YouTube channel, and the slides will be made available as well. Let me just thank everyone again, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much.